He thought it would be the job of a lifetime, working behind the scenes for the biggest star in the world. But what he witnessed backstage was nothing like the glamour the crowd saw. Because before every show, something unholy took place. Something no one was supposed to see. And on his very first night, he saw it all. He had always dreamed of working a big tour. The lights, the sound, the energy for a stage tech. This was the closest thing to touching stardom. And when the call came for Beyoncé's world tour, he felt like he had won the lottery. The first night was a blur of cables, heavy speakers, and endless checklists. He moved with the rhythm of the crew, caught between exhaustion and awe. Everywhere he turned, there were layers of perfection. Managers barking orders, choreographers rehearsing routines, stylists sweeping past with racks of glittering costumes. But the perfection had cracks. Certain corridors were marked with red tape, not for safety, but secrecy. Doors were locked, guarded by men who weren't part of the regular crew. And the veterans, the ones who had been on tour before, all carried the same haunted look in their eyes. They smiled, but their smiles never reached their faces. When he asked one of them why parts of the backstage were off limits, the man just shook his head. Do your job. Don't wander. That's the first rule if you want to last here. It should have been nothing. Just another job. Another rule. But something in the man's tone unsettled him. It wasn't a warning about safety. It was a warning about survival. And that night, as he coiled cables in the shadows, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't just working a concert. He was stepping into something much darker. What he didn't know was that his first night on the job would open the door to something he could never unsee. He wasn't supposed to be near the South Corridor, but work always had a way of pulling him into places he didn't belong. It was late, the arena almost empty, and he was running cable lines near the stage wings when he heard it for the first time. At first, it sounded like static bleeding from one of the amps. But then he stopped, and the sound didn't fade. It grew clearer, layered, like voices. Whispers. He pressed closer to the wall, the kind of curiosity he knew he shouldn't give into pulling him step by step. The whispers weren't random conversations. They weren't words traded between roadies. No, these were low, steady, rhythmic, like chanting. The air grew heavier as he followed the sound. His throat tightened, and the closer he got, the more he felt like he was standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. He turned a corner, expecting to see maybe a huddle of backup dancers or a late-night rehearsal, but the hallway was empty. Empty, except for the markings. Someone had drawn across the black-painted cinder blocks. Thin, chalky lines looping in spirals, circles inside circles. They weren't doodles. They weren't notes. They looked ancient. He bent closer, dragging a hand across the wall, and a powdery film clung to his skin. "What the hell is this?" he muttered to himself. A voice came from behind him, a veteran stagehand, a man with hollow eyes who'd been with the tour longer than anyone. "You don't ask questions about that." The tech straightened, embarrassed, but the man didn't walk away. He leaned in close, so close the younger tech could smell the sourness of his breath. "You hear things? You see things? Pretend you didn't. That's how you last here." And then he walked away, not even waiting for an answer. That should have been the end of it. He told himself he was overtired. He told himself crews always had their rituals, superstitions to make sure the show went smooth. But as he walked back to coil his last line, the whispers drifted again, louder this time, not hidden in the walls. They came from behind a door marked "Do Not Enter." He froze, cables still in his hands, every muscle tight. The voices inside were chanting in a rhythm that didn't sound like prayer. It sounded older, stranger, too slow to be a song, too sharp to be anything human. And beneath the chanting, he swore he heard something else. Something like a faint cry. His fingers went slick with sweat. His instinct screamed at him to run, but his body stayed locked in place. He stood there, straining to hear, until the handle rattled from the inside. He jumped back, heart hammering, and nearly tripped over the coiled wires at his feet. The door never opened. The chanting stopped. But as he fled down the hallway, he realized something that made his blood run cold. It wasn't just that the chanting had stopped. It was the silence. Too perfect, too complete, like the building itself was holding its breath. Later that night, during sound check, he swore he heard the same whispers carried faintly through the speakers. None of the other techs reacted. No one else even flinched. It was like he was the only one who could hear it. He told himself he wouldn't go near that door again. He told himself whatever was happening behind it wasn't his problem. But even as he tried to sleep in the tour bus, the whispers followed him. He could almost hear them brushing against his ear, threading into his dreams. And somewhere deep down, he knew the veteran was right. He should have pretended he didn't hear, pretended he didn't see. But he had already stepped too close to the line. What he didn't know was that the whispers were only the beginning. Soon, he would hear screams. The whispers stayed with him, curling at the edges of his mind like smoke. He tried to bury himself in work, checking the rigging, tightening bolts, running cables. But the more he tried to ignore them, the more he seemed to drift toward the places he wasn't supposed to go. It happened on his third night. The crew was scrambling to set up before the evening rehearsal, and he'd been sent to deliver a bundle of cables to the far wing of the arena. He knew the route, had walked it enough times to do it half asleep. But somehow, almost without realizing, he took a wrong turn. The corridor was darker here, lit only by a single buzzing bulb. The concrete floor dipped slightly, as if it had been built at a slant, and the sound of his boots echoed back sharper than usual, like someone else was walking behind him. At the end of the hall was a door. Not locked, not marked, but cracked open just enough to spill a faint orange glow across the floor. He should have turned around, dropped the cables, gone back to the noise and chaos of the main stage. But something in that glow tugged at him, a strange pull that bypassed reason. Against every instinct, he pressed his hand to the door and eased it open. The smell hit him first. Not sweat, not smoke, not the usual funk of an arena. This was metallic, sharp, like rust mixed with incense. The air inside the room felt thick, syrupy, like it wanted to cling to his lungs. And then he saw it. A table stood in the center, draped in black fabric. On it lay a figure, still, silent, pale. The light from the candle scattered around the room flickered across her skin, and for a moment he thought his brain was playing tricks on him. It was Beyoncé. At least it looked like her. Her chest barely moved, lips faintly parted, as if she was caught between waking and death. Around her stood 4 people in dark clothing, their faces half hidden in the shadows. Their hands moved in slow, deliberate motions, tracing patterns in the air. And then, across from the table, Another figure shifted. He froze, eyes widening, because this one looked like Beyoncé too. She stood upright, hair falling in perfect waves, her posture flawless, radiant in a way that felt unnatural. Her eyes snapped open, and even from across the room, he swore her gaze met his. For one terrible second, he thought she had seen him. But she didn't speak. She only smiled, and her teeth glimmered too white, too even, like something sculpted instead of grown. His knees buckled, and he stumbled back into the hall, heart pounding so hard it made his vision blur. He pressed himself against the cold wall, fighting to breathe. The voices inside rose, not whispers this time, but words, heavy and jagged, like they were cutting through the air. He forced himself to stagger away, clutching the cables to his chest like they could protect him. Every step felt like wading through water, every sound magnified, as though the arena itself was listening. By the time he rejoined the main crew, sweat plastered his shirt to his back. Nobody asked where he'd been. Nobody looked twice at him. But when he dropped the cables onto the cart, his hands shook so violently that one of the younger techs gave him a confused glance. He wanted to tell someone, wanted to spill everything he'd just seen, the candles, the table, the double, but the words refused to come. Something deep in his gut told him that if he spoke, if he said it out loud, the thing he saw would know, and it would come for him. So he swallowed his terror, forced himself to keep moving, to keep working. But every time the crowd roared during rehearsal, every time the lights flashed and the music rattled the arena, he thought of that other Beyoncé standing tall in the candlelight, smiling a smile that wasn't human. That night, when he tried to sleep, the smile followed him into the dark. But that was only a glimpse. The full horror came when he saw the switch happen with his own eyes. He thought he could convince himself it had been stress, a hallucination, maybe even a dream. But the universe wasn't going to let him hide behind excuses. The truth was waiting for him, and it chose the worst possible moment to show itself. It was minutes before the biggest show of the tour. The arena was boiling with noise, thousands of voices rising and crashing like waves. Backstage, the crew moved like ants in a frenzy. Every light adjusted, every cable checked, every cue rehearsed down to the second. And in the chaos, no one noticed him slip into the wrong corridor. He hadn't meant to. He was rushing to deliver a final toolkit when the crowd's roar shook the walls. The vibration knocked something loose in him, and suddenly, he was standing in front of a door he recognized, the one with the faint orange glow. But this time, the door wasn't cracked. It was wide open. He stepped inside before he could think better of it, and what he saw turned his blood to ice. The room was alive with flame. Black candles lined the walls, dripping wax into bowls etched with symbols that seemed to writhe when he looked at them too long. The table in the center was no longer just a table. It was an altar, draped in velvet, stained darker in the center where a body lay. It was her again, Beyoncé. Still pale, eyes closed as if she were sleeping, except her lips moved faintly, whispering something no one could hear. Her hands twitched once and then went limp again. Around her, the figures in black raised their arms, voices climbing in unison. The air itself seemed to vibrate, the pitch so low it rattled in his ribs. The language was wrong, twisted, broken, filled with sounds the human mouth wasn't meant to make. And then, across the altar, it happened. Another figure stepped forward. At first, he thought it was a mirror, her reflection moving toward her. But no mirror moved like that. No reflection breathed. This one was warm, glowing with a strange radiance that made the candlelight dim. She looked flawless, untouched, not by sweat, not by fear, not by time. The two versions of her faced each other, one limp, the other smiling. He wanted to look away. Every instinct screamed at him to turn, to run, but his body refused to move. He was chained by the sight of it, by the horror unfolding in front of him. The chanting rose to a fever pitch. The air turned metallic, stinging his tongue like he was licking copper. His nose burned with the sharp tang of blood. And then the limp Beyoncé's body arched upward, a soundless scream twisting her face. Her eyes rolled back, and a thin stream of light, white, shimmering, alive, pulled itself out of her chest. It floated across the altar, writhing like smoke caught in a current, before sinking into the radiant figure waiting with open arms. The moment it touched her, she inhaled sharply, like she had just been born. The husk on the altar collapsed, skin graying, lips cracked. She looked like a shell emptied of its soul. Her eyes opened once, just long enough to glance into the shadows where he stood frozen. And in that brief second, he swore she was looking right at him, pleading silently, begging. The new Beyoncé stepped down from the altar, every movement perfect, precise, rehearsed. She adjusted her hair, smoothed her flawless skin, and when she smiled, the whole room seemed to bow beneath it. The chanting cut off in an instant. Silence slammed into the space like a hammer. And then, as if nothing had happened, the doors to the arena opened. A handler rushed in, whispering into a headset, "She's ready. Send her up." He pressed himself against the wall as they ushered her past. She walked with the poise of a queen, every step dripping with power. But when her eyes flicked across him for the smallest moment, he felt them pierce through his skull, like she knew he'd seen. Behind her, two men dragged the husk away, its head lolling, lips still moving faintly. His stomach turned. He stumbled back into the corridor, bile rising in his throat. The crowd outside erupted in cheers, the floor trembling with worship. And all he could think was that the woman they were cheering for wasn't human anymore. He thought he could just walk away, pretend he saw nothing, but the contract didn't work that way. He couldn't work the next day. His hands trembled so badly he dropped 2 cables and nearly got himself thrown off the crew. His head spun with the memory of what he had seen. The husk, the light, the smile that wasn't human. Every time the crowd erupted in cheers, it sounded less like joy and more like worship. He kept telling himself he had imagined it. He wanted to believe it was exhaustion, the heat of the lights, too much caffeine. But deep down, he knew. He had seen it. He had seen her die and something else take her place. That night, while he sat on a crate in the loading bay, trying to breathe through the panic rising in his chest, an older stagehand appeared beside him. A man he had noticed before, gray in his beard, eyes hollow like burned-out bulbs. The kind of man who had seen too much. "You saw it, didn't you?" the older man asked. The younger tech froze. He didn't answer, couldn't answer, but his silence was enough. The older man sat down heavily, rubbing his temples. They always try to keep the new ones from finding out so soon. Guess you were unlucky. His mouth was dry. What What was that? Who was that? The man gave a humorless laugh. It was her. And it wasn't. You think someone like her stays flawless for decades without paying a price? You think human bones and blood could carry a voice like that forever? Number. She signed a contract long ago. The kind of contract you don't walk away from. He wanted to laugh it off. Wanted to tell the man he was crazy, that this was some sick joke. But the memory of the husk, the look in its eyes, stopped the words dead in his throat. The man leaned closer, his voice low. Every show takes something. That's the deal. You want the world to worship you? You want to never age, never falter, never stumble under the weight of exhaustion? Then you give yourself over. And in return, something else steps in, polishes you, makes you shine brighter than any human ever could. That's the price of perfection. He shook his head. That wasn't perfection. That was something else. The older man's face darkened. Call it what you want. Demon, spirit, parasite. Doesn't matter. It's older than any of us. Older than music itself. And it doesn't stop with her? You think she's the only one? Number. Half the names you see on posters, half the faces on billboards, they've signed the same deal. Different rituals. Same contract. The younger tech stared at him, heart pounding. And us? What about us? The man sighed, heavy, defeated. We're bound to it too. You think the crew sticks around for the money? Number. Once you've seen the ritual, once you've heard the chant, you're part of it. You leave, you talk, you break the silence, and it finds you. It tears your life apart until there's nothing left. We're all bound to protect the illusion. That's why no one speaks. That's why we keep our heads down. A chill spread through him, colder than anything he'd felt before. It wasn't just what he had seen. It was the realization that he was trapped. This wasn't just Beyoncé's contract. It was theirs, too. The older man stood, his joints cracking as he stretched. Here's your choice. Pretend it never happened. Keep your mouth shut. Do your job. If you're lucky, maybe you'll survive the tour without being pulled in deeper. Or you can fight it. Try to run. But if you do, pray you're faster than the thing that owns her. He left those words hanging in the air, walking off into the shadows of the arena, leaving the younger tech alone with the roar of the crowd seeping through the concrete walls. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel like part of a crew. He felt like a prisoner. Every wire he coiled, every light he checked, felt less like work and more like shackles tightening around his wrists. And as the night wore on, a thought began to fester, one he couldn't shake. If the contract wasn't just hers, then how many others had signed? How many of the stars he had worshipped weren't stars at all, but shells filled with something else? And it wasn't just Beyoncé. The truth was far darker. The contract covered many stars. The show that night was flawless. The crowd screamed until their throats tore raw. Lights bathed the arena in gold, and the music thundered like a heartbeat in the concrete. From the outside, it was everything fans had paid for. Perfection. But to him, standing in the shadows of the stage, nothing looked the same anymore. He couldn't stop watching her. Not because he wanted to, but because he was terrified not to. Every movement, every smile, every note carried a weight he hadn't noticed before. And now that he knew the truth, the cracks were everywhere. Her reflection in the polished floor didn't match her body. He noticed it first during a dance routine. Her legs moved a fraction slower in the reflection, as though whatever was inside her forgot how to keep up. For a second, the shadow bent at an impossible angle, like a puppet tugged by the wrong string. He blinked, and it was gone. He told himself he imagined it. But then her voice hit. It wasn't just powerful, it was crushing. The sound rolled over him like a wave, pressing down on his chest until he thought his ribs would snap. His ears rang with a metallic pitch sharp enough to draw tears. No one else seemed to notice. Fans screamed with joy, arms raised, eyes glazed like worshippers before an altar. But for him, the sound was unbearable, inhuman. When she turned her head just for a heartbeat, her eyes found his. He swore the pupil stretched thin and slit-like like a serpent's. And then she blinked, and they were normal again. He staggered back into the wings, gasping for air. Another crew member gave him a puzzled look. "First time seeing her up close?" he asked with a smirk. He couldn't answer. His throat had locked up. All he could do was nod and pretend he was fine. Pretend he hadn't just seen the face of something pretending to be human. The performance continued. Every song seemed to pull the crowd deeper into a frenzy. They weren't just excited. They were entranced. Their cheers weren't random noise. They were rhythmic, pulsing in time with the music, like thousands of voices chanting in worship. He realized then that the show wasn't a concert at all. It was a ritual on a massive scale, fueled by adoration, feeding whatever lived inside that body. His hands shook as he held a spotlight steady. He knew now what the older tech meant. This wasn't work. This was service. Service to something ancient. Something hungry. Later, backstage, when the set ended and the audience roared for an encore, he caught sight of her again. She was smiling, radiant, flawless, but when she stepped past him, her shadow stretched the wrong way, up the wall, bending toward the ceiling like it wanted to crawl free. No one else reacted. No one else ever did. He wanted to scream, to rip the headset from his ear and run, but his legs wouldn't move. He realized he was trembling not just with fear, but with the sickening awareness that some part of him was being pulled too. That the music was inside him, tugging at his heartbeat, sinking it to hers. He pressed his back against the wall, forcing his eyes shut, whispering to himself, "You didn't see that. You didn't hear that. Pretend. Just pretend." But when he opened his eyes, she was staring at him from across the hall, her lips curled, not into the smile the world adored, but into something sharper. For an instant, he thought he saw her teeth glint too long, too pointed. Then she blinked, adjusted her costume, and walked toward the dressing room like nothing had happened. He turned away, bile burning in his throat. The truth clawed at him now. This wasn't an act of preservation. It wasn't even about her anymore. Whatever had stepped into her skin was feeding, thriving, and the audience wasn't resisting. They were giving themselves over willingly. The glamour wasn't real. It was painted over blood. He thought he'd reached the edge of horror, that he'd seen the worst. But he was wrong. The real nightmare came when he saw where they kept the husks. He couldn't sleep. Every night, the music replayed in his skull like a curse. Every cheer of the crowd rang in his ears like a chant. And always behind it, The image of her shadow stretching wrong, her reflection lagging, her eyes flashing something that wasn't human. By the fifth show, his body was on autopilot, coiling wires, checking lights, hauling gear. But his mind was somewhere else, locked on the memory of the husk being dragged away. He needed to know where they had taken it. He needed proof that he wasn't losing his mind. So he waited. When the arena emptied out, when the last crew members filtered back to their bunks or buses, he lingered, pretending to check equipment, pretending to double back for tools, until the halls grew quiet, until the only sound was the hum of the cooling lights overhead. That's when he saw them. Two handlers pushing a crate, long and low, its wheels squealing against the concrete. The crate was covered with a black tarp, but even from a distance he knew by the way one corner sagged, by the faint twitch beneath the fabric. They disappeared through a door he had never seen open before, a heavy steel door, marked only with a faded sticker that read, "Storage." His heart pounded so loud he thought it might give him away. But he followed, keeping low, pressing his body against the cold wall as the handlers slid inside. He counted to 10, then 20 before the door clicked shut. When the hall fell silent, he moved. The door wasn't locked. His hand shook as he gripped the handle, every instinct screaming for him to stop. But instinct had never burned as hot as the need to know. He pulled the door open and slipped inside. The smell hit him first. Damp, foul, tinged with something rotten. The air was thick, like a cellar where the dead had been buried too shallow. And then his eyes adjusted to the dark. The room was vast, lined with rows of crates. Some were closed, nailed shut. Others weren't. Lids hung open, and inside, lit by the faint red glow of a single overhead bulb, were bodies. Not dead. Not alive. Something in between. They twitched. Fingers curled and uncurled. Eyes rolled, half-lidded, cloudy but searching. Their lips moved silently, mouths forming words without sound. Dozens of them, dozens of Beyoncés. His stomach lurched. He staggered forward, then froze as one of them turned its head toward him. Its eyes locked onto his with a desperate clarity, and its lips shaped two words. "Help me." He stumbled back, knocking into a crate. The wood creaked, and another husk shifted inside, its hands scraping against the inside lid like claws. A low moan drifted from its throat, wet and broken, and then more voices joined in. A chorus of whispers, dozens of them, all begging, pleading, overlapping into a nightmare. "Don't leave us. Please. It hurts." He clamped a hand over his mouth, choking on bile. His vision blurred as the reality hit him like a hammer. She hadn't been switched once, not twice, but countless times. Every show, every city, every tour. The same ritual repeated, the same essence drained, leaving behind another husk, tossed into this chamber of suffering. The glamour on stage was built on this. The perfection the world worshipped was a mask stretched over an endless graveyard. His knees buckled, and he pressed himself against a crate, gasping for air. The husk inside twitched violently, fingers brushing the crack of the lid, and he scrambled away. His boot caught on another tarp, and it slid free, revealing a face, her face, skin gray, lips split, teeth chattering like a wind-up doll wound too tight. He fell backward, crashing into the wall. The whispers rose, louder now, as if the entire chamber had woken to his presence. The door behind him creaked. He froze. A shadow stretched across the floor, long and bent, spilling into the room before the figure appeared. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. The door swung open fully, and one of the handlers stepped inside. For a moment, their eyes met, and he thought it was over, that he would be dragged into a crate of his own. But the handler only stared at him, face flat, unreadable. Then, with a slow shake of his head, he spoke. "You shouldn't be here." The words were calm, too calm. And then he pulled the door closed again, leaving the tech in the dark, surrounded by whispers. His heart slammed in his chest as he scrambled out, fumbling for the handle, bursting back into the corridor. He staggered into the open hall, drenched in sweat, every inch of him shaking. He knew now the truth, and it was worse than anything he could have imagined. The stage wasn't powered by music or talent. It was powered by bodies sacrificed over and over. And as he leaned against the wall, gasping for air, one thought gnawed at him. Sooner or later, he wouldn't just be a witness. Soon, he'd be forced to take part in the ritual himself. He tried to avoid it after that night. He threw himself into work, kept his eyes low, ears plugged. Anything to stay away from the doors that led deeper backstage. But once you've stepped too close, once you've seen too much, the contract doesn't let you slip away. It happened 3 nights later. The show was behind schedule, tension thick enough to choke on. Crew members whispered nervously into their headsets. Managers barked orders, and even the handlers seemed on edge. Something wasn't right. When the crowd roared for the opening, the new version of her should have been ready. But the chamber had gone wrong. He didn't know how. Maybe the chanting faltered. Maybe the offering wasn't enough. But whatever had gone wrong had left her half-formed. He saw her stumble into the corridor, radiant for only a second before her body convulsed violently, her face twisting, melting in and out of perfection like a signal cutting in and out. The handlers grabbed her, dragging her back toward the ritual room. One of them spotted him standing frozen nearby. "You, come with us." He tried to shake his head, tried to stammer some excuse, but they were already hauling him forward. A pair of rough hands clamped down on his shoulders, shoving him through the door and into the circle. The room was chaos. Candles sputtered, their flames flaring unnaturally bright. The air reeked of burnt copper and sweat. The husk on the altar writhed, twitching violently, her eyes wide and wild. Her lips moved, not chanting, but gasping, whispering something desperate, a plea no one wanted to hear. The figures in black turned towards him. One shoved a small blade into his palm. "Hold her down. Cut here." The voice was flat, commanding, as if he were nothing more than another tool in the ritual. His stomach turned. I can't." "You will." The voice snapped like a whip. They forced him forward, his knees slamming against the side of the altar. The husk's eyes locked onto his, and for the first time in days, he saw a flash of something real. Terror. Human terror. Her lips mouthed 2 words. "Help me." His throat closed. His hand shook so violently he nearly dropped the blade, but the robed figure pressed down on his wrist, guiding the edge to her skin. The chanting rose again, low and guttural, vibrating through the floor. The husk arched beneath him, her chest rising as though something inside was clawing to get out. The blade sliced shallow across her arm, and black fluid seeped out, steaming where it touched the fabric. The air around him shimmered, bending, warping. And then the light began to pull, thin strands of it, silvery and alive, writhing upward like smoke from a fire. It hovered above the husk, twisting and spinning before being sucked into the other figure waiting nearby. She gasped, inhaling it greedily, her skin smoothing, her form stabilizing, her face solidifying into flawless beauty. The room seemed to bow to her as the husk beneath him withered, collapsing into stillness. He stumbled back, dropping the blade. His hands were slick with sweat, his chest heaving like he'd run for miles. The robed figures didn't look at him, didn't thank him. They simply continued the chant until the last thread of light vanished. The new Beyoncé straightened, radiant, perfect once again. She adjusted her hair, tilted her head, and smiled. That same too wide smile that wasn't made for human faces. Her eyes flicked toward him just for a second, and in them he saw triumph, ownership. The husk on the altar let out one final shuddering breath. Then its lips twitched, forming a single broken whisper. He leaned closer, against his will, straining to hear. It was his name. He staggered back, heart slamming against his ribs. No one else reacted. No one cared. The husk was dragged away, tossed onto a waiting cart like garbage, and the radiant figure was escorted to the stage, ready to shine. He pressed against the wall, shaking so violently he thought his bones might snap. He'd crossed a line he could never uncross. He wasn't just a witness anymore. He was part of it. He had held the blade. He had played his role. And as he stumbled back into the corridor, bile burning his throat, the older tech's words echoed in his skull. Once you've seen it, you're bound to it. He thought helping once would free him, but it only bound him deeper. The tour ended, but his nightmare didn't. When the last encore faded and the trucks were packed, he thought maybe, just maybe, he could slip back into his old life, that he could walk away, bury himself in small gigs, and pretend none of it had ever happened. But the contract wasn't written in paper. It was carved into silence, etched into his mind, and it didn't let go. The first sign came in the hotel room the night after the final show. He flipped on the television, desperate for noise, for anything to drown out the images burned into his brain. There she was, already smiling on the screen, glowing in an interview, flawless and perfect, as if she hadn't just been remade hours earlier. The sound of her voice twisted in the speakers, sweet to anyone else, but to him it carried something deeper. A resonance that thrummed in his bones, a vibration that made his teeth ache. He shut the TV off, but the echo lingered in the walls. Sleep was no escape. The moment his eyes closed, he was back in the chamber. The husks whispered his name, their mouths moving in the dark. He saw their gray hands reaching for him, clawing through the cracks of their crates, pulling him down into the red glow. He woke drenched in sweat, the taste of blood on his tongue, certain he'd heard them chanting from beneath the bed. Back home, he tried to rebuild a routine. Small theaters, local gigs, simple work, but the silence followed. The crew he worked with looked at him strangely, like they could smell something on him, something wrong. And every time he caught his reflection in the polished glass of a spotlight or the sheen of a guitar, it lagged just for a heartbeat, just long enough to make him flinch. He stopped calling friends, stopped answering family. Isolation felt safer. though even then he knew safety was an illusion. Once, on the subway, he caught a headline on another passenger's phone. An article praising her for her eternal youth, her ageless beauty, her otherworldly stamina. The passenger laughed, scrolling, but to him, the words weren't praise. They were confession. One night, he heard it again. Not in the arena, not through speakers, but in his own apartment. A whisper, low, steady, curling out of the shadows. He followed it, trembling, and found nothing. No candles, no altars, just the dark. But the whisper didn't stop. He realized then it wasn't coming from outside. It was inside. He smashed mirrors, covered windows, tried to block out reflections, tried to block out the sound. But when the phone rang and he picked it up, the line didn't carry a voice. It carried the chant, that same low rhythm, too old, too jagged to belong to anything human. He dropped the phone, heart slamming, sweat pouring down his back. And that's when he understood. He hadn't escaped. The tour hadn't freed him. It had marked him. He wasn't just a stagehand anymore. He was part of the contract. He remembered the husk mouthing his name, the way the air bent when the blade cut, the way her shadow had reached for him across the corridor. He remembered the older tech's warning. If you're lucky, maybe you'll survive without being pulled in deeper. But luck had already run out. Because now, when he saw her face on screens, he didn't just see her. He saw all of them. The husks, the drained version stacked in boxes, whispering in the dark. And when she smiled for the camera, he swore he saw her lips curve into something sharper, something that wasn't meant for the public eye, meant only for him. The contract hadn't ended with the show. It had followed him home. And late one night, as he sat alone in the dark, the whispers finally grew clear enough to understand. They weren't just chants. They were words. A name repeated over and over in dozens of broken voices. His name. The husks weren't begging anymore. They were calling.